Steve is a founding member of Responsive Org and Director of Customer Success at Culture Amp. He's also been through an incredible journey himself, I think personally and certainly professionally over the last 2 years. There's a framework developed by Stan McChrystal and the McChrystal Group called Team of Teams, which Steve will go into, and Jeff Eggers, also of the McChrystal Group, will touch on tomorrow. And at Culture Amp, which has 4 offices in San Francisco, New York, Melbourne, and London, so across a wide variety of time zones, they've been implementing this Team of Teams approach over the last couple of years. And I think it's a really interesting strategy. It's also a really challenging one. And so Steve is here today to talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of implementing Team of Teams at Culture Amp. It's my great honor to introduce Steve Hopkins. I'll give them a round of applause.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, we'll do a little hug. Can everybody hear me okay? It's a weird sort of vibe. Thank you. It's really nice to be introduced like that. That's sort of one of the perks of doing these things. You get to be introduced, which is sort of special. So yeah, look, today I'm really excited and privileged to sort of be here standing in front of you. I'm sorry I'm not going to do much more dancing or movements. Sorry to sort of put you back into your thinking mind. But what I really wanted to sort of share with you today, hopefully, is not too much in the thinking mind. I really wanted to say, I loved the previous session. Who was in here for the last, actually the second to last session with the Pepsi folks, the folks from Pepsi? Who was in that session? Yeah, cool. Good smattering of you. So I was really, that to me is what this community can help provide to each other and to the greater world and the greater good. I kind of am a big believer that within this room we have all of the intelligence and nous and sort of there's just the whole felt experience of what we need to do to make transitions to working in an organizational model like what I'm going to talk about today. But I think the catch is we have to share it with each other. We have to talk about what we're trying. We have to talk about what operational things we're doing and the realities of that, and kind of talk about how it's hard and talk about how it's good and talk about how we're doing well, but also talk about how we're not doing so well. And so today I want to try to give you a little bit of a flavour of that and the journey that we've been on at Culture Amp. So I'm going to walk you through how we think about being culture first, which is kind of what we call this, but then I'm also going to walk you through the Team of Teams approach that we've taken and how we've thought about adopting that. But before we get there, I want to talk to you a little bit about a chap by the name of Abraham Wald. Now, Abraham was born sort of in the early 1900s. He grew up in Romania, a very smart and mathematically gifted young man. And sort of shortly after he graduated high school, and sort of went out through college and then kind of continued going up, he found himself in a Europe that at that time of our history, as we all know, was politically and economically devastated, basically. And so shortly after that, he sort of moved over to here. He moved over to the United States and sort of found home in Colorado Springs. There's somebody else that made that transition earlier this morning. I remember somebody saying, but anyway, it caught my ear. Where he sort of joined a think tank, but it was sort of as a fairly entry-level role for someone that had kind of had accumulated the experience that he had in his time back in Europe. And then sort of eventually, all of this, he finally lands actually here in New York at Columbia University as a professor in mathematics. And now, what's interesting about that is not really a whole lot, except for the fact that group at Columbia was co-opted by the American military. We're in about the late 1930s here. Was co-opted by the American military to form what became known as the Statistical Research Group, or the SRG. Now, the SRG was really the first body that had been pulled together within the US to really take not just a sort of militaristic point of view at the problems that they were trying to solve in the military context, but was more trying to take a mathematical and statistical approach to solving those problems. And one of the problems that Wald solved himself was an image that many of you might be familiar with, some of you won't be, but that's quite okay, around trying to understand how to better make investments in how you put armour onto military planes, ensuring that they come home. Has anybody seen an image like this or sort of familiar with the... Okay, cool. So this forms the basis of what we now know as survivorship bias. But at the time, really they were just trying to figure out how the heck do we get more planes home? We're losing all these planes, they're going out to war, and they're not coming back as often as we would like to. Now, when you look at an image like this, and as Wald sort of looked at the image, as he sort of thought about that problem, it's very easy when you're trying to think about that problem to jump straight to the conclusion, right? If you're all looking at this image and the question is, where do we need to put more armour on the planes to make sure they come home? You tend to sort of look at the image and you tend to say, well, we need to put it where all the bullet holes are. That doesn't take a lot of thought. That's where we're getting shot. That's where we need to invest more money. But it's not really an easy problem to solve in that same way. It's a problem that brings with it, or it is along a spectrum. And you can make investments at one end of that spectrum or the other. So you can heavily armour the plane across every inch of its body. And that will stop it certainly from being more likely to be downed by a bullet or something like that. But you also make the aircraft really heavy. It means that you have to burn more fuel to keep it in the air, and it also means it's much less responsive in a dogfight. You can go the other extreme and just kind of put planes up there without any armour at all. They'll be much more nimble, much more adaptive, much cheaper on the fuel cost, but one shot or one bullet hole is more likely to bring it down. And so this was actually the problem that Wald was charged with solving. Where along that spectrum do we make the investment to right-size the amount of armour that we're putting on the planes? And so as he began looking at it and the military sort of started talking to him about what they had felt in the field, it was, again, like I said, really obvious. Well, we need to put armour in all of these places. This is where the armour must go. And Wald, as he sort of dug into it and thought about it and took his statistical approach, actually said, well, actually, that's good and that will help us a little bit, but actually the armour needs to go everywhere that the bullet holes are not. And if we think about this for a moment, you kind of can see the rationale in it. For those of you that aren't familiar with this sort of analogy, let me know, because it took me a little while to get this as well. But basically, all of the planes that are getting shot down and not coming back are doing so because they're getting bullet holes in these areas. They're not in your sample when they return home. They didn't make it back. So you can't actually ever do any analysis on them because they don't exist. So you have to look at where they have not been, or the evidence of being shot down by enemy fire isn't. And that was really what Wald kind of brought to the table, and the SRG brought to the table for the whole of the American military, is sort of helping to understand, well, how do we think about that? It's just like the sort of old saying, of a drunk looking for their keys that they've dropped under the only street light in an otherwise dark street. Because, of course, that's where you'd find them, right? Like, oh, where did you drop your keys? Oh, I don't know, somewhere. Why are you looking under the light? Well, because it's light here. It's, I can see it. And so really what Wald helped us understand was that what's important here is not about searching just under the light, but it's about increasing the amount of light that you have at your disposal to be able to look for those keys and to be able to sort of think about those problems as they're coming to you. So when we think about that, and we think about we're in this room, right? So we're in this room, we're all here today, we're all trying to make transitions in one way or another to becoming a more responsive organisation. We're all trying to adopt a responsive operating model in one way or the other that's kind of helping us push along a path. And wherever that path might be, we're all trying to do it. And in doing that, we actually do have a data set available to us that we can utilise that helps us sort of spread that light. That is the equivalent, if you like, of Wald's kind of planes coming back and sort of being able to sort of measure where all the bullet holes are. And that data set is people data. And it's my contention and my sort of, I guess, challenge to us in the room today that we're not using it enough when we're thinking about making these transitions to a different operating model. And so today I'm sort of going to walk us through a little bit about some of the ways that we've used that approach in our own journey towards making that kind of transition. And so when we think about that kind of transition and the way we're trying to use that data, it's important for us to sort of think about, well, how are we going to go about doing that? How is it that we'll use that data to kind of help inform the culture and the organisation that we're kind of trying to build on? And so this is sort of a way that we think about it at Culture Amp. We think about this as a culture sprint or sort of any other approach. Our results to action framework is kind of what we call it. But basically the idea is that you're looking to sort of begin by collecting feedback at all. And so really when we're sort of trying to make many of these sort of leaps and jumps, we're not actually ever collecting feedback in the first place. And so it can actually be quite hard to go back after the fact and kind of look at data and understand, well, what were we trying to achieve with that culture change? What were we trying to achieve with that more responsive model? Did we do it? So, we begin by collecting feedback, and by doing that whenever we realise that's a good idea, look to understand that and then sort of focus our efforts or our energies on sort of one kind of part of that that idea. Maybe sort of shrink that data down, just like Wald did, and ask, well, we want to first understand, why are the planes not coming back? And then once we know that, then we can kind of dig in and kind of come up with some ideas about how we might be able to get around that. You then ideate, and then you look to sort of really share that ideation out as widely as you can before then taking action and saying, yeah, how are we going to, now that we know all this stuff, now that we have more insight about, how we're going on this change journey, how are we going to actually do something? How are we going to act and make that work? And then you sort of want to measure and kind of come back to do it all again. Now, the thing is, and sort of this really, as I was sort of preparing for this talk and kind of thinking about what is it that I really want to kind of engage with and what is it that I really sort of want to think about, it came back to me that, if we're trying to make a decision like this, if we're trying to sort of, if you think that the challenge or the problem that we're trying to face is trying to make that change to becoming a more responsive organisation, we really can't make that change unless we kind of pause for a moment and consider one really important question kind of at the core of that. And that question is basically, why are we doing it in the first place? Why is it that we are going to, why does any company or organisation here in the room, why are we all going to move to this model? Why would we, Anil actually sort of mentioned this a little bit in the previous session where he was talking about the open salaries or the idea of opening up salary data. Nobody else is going to do this necessarily. Why is it that we're the ones that are going to choose to make a change like this and sort of move to this new model that actually we don't all intuitively understand how to kind of make work or know the nuances of kind of making it happen? And if we do make that change and we do sort of bite down on that and kind of go, yeah, okay, well, we're going to do it, then it's actually much more likely that we're going to fail whilst we do it. It's likely that we're going to do it poorly just because it's the first time that we're doing it. And then, step again and say, all right, well, we're going to adopt this model and, okay, we're comfortable that we're going to do it poorly and we're going to work together more poorly than we did in the past when we just had this sort of old school model in our heads. And then you kind of consider, well, how do we know if we're wrong? How do we know if actually going through all of that pain and all of that process was actually still the right decision? How do we know that it was the right decision but maybe we've implemented it poorly? Or that it was a bad decision that we actually have to roll back? And so I think that's sort of really where I want to sort of pause today and kind of walk us through that a little bit. Just going to pause for a quick drink. And so, yeah, today I want to really, we actually use this term in the manual, but I'd like to sort of open the kimono a little bit and just talk through a little bit about Culture Amp and how we've kind of come along on that journey, how we've done adopting that model, and kind of talk through some of the tensions and conflicts that we've seen prevalent as we've gone about adopting that change, and then talk about some of the things that we've kind of tactically or concretely done to try to address those things. Then finally kind of share some examples, the things that I sort of started talking about, give us the chance here whilst I have the stage and whilst we're all in the room together to kind of share some things that we've worked on at least that may or may not be interesting to you to kind of think about as you go about delivering that change in your model. But the first thing to kind of think about when we talk about this from our perspective is that it's really hard. This kind of change is really hard. And actually, Chris Fussell, who is a colleague of Jeff, who's speaking tomorrow, kind of talks about this. It's always hard. It's a hard thing to do, and it always remains hard. And so for us, I think it's been a hard journey. But I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about how successful we've been, just so you know sort of where we're at. I mean, we're not a small little company anymore. We have now 1,000 customers. We've been through Series A, Series B, Series C. We're kind of growing up as a business ourselves. As Robin sort of said, we've got 4 offices around the world: London, New York, here, San Francisco, and then Melbourne is where our headquarters are. We've launched 20,000 surveys, or we've helped customers launch 20,000 surveys. We've had millions upon millions and millions of questions answered. And so, all of this is not to brag or kind of show you how good it is. It's to show you that even amongst all of these things, as we've been on that journey, over the last kind of 6 years since we were founded, and particularly the last 2 years that we've adopted the team of teams model, is that even as all of this has been going on, we've been managing to kind of achieve those results, and we're kind of still on that journey. So today I want to talk to you, like I said, I'll sort of open the kimono up a little bit, and I want to talk a little about some fears that we've seen kind of evident in that transition, and as we've sort of gone about adopting that model, and kind of sort of get into that. So without any further ado, I might move on to our first one that we've kind of seen playing that in action. So before we go any further, I'd like to everyone to close their eyes for a moment. and just kind of put yourself in a place where you're in your sort of normal working environment. You've got your laptop or your desktop or whatever it is, you're in front of your machine, and you open it up, and there's just the normal kind of flow of work going on. You might be in Slack, you might be in email, you might be in whatever it is, and you look at that and you kind of look at something that you're particularly looking to work on, and you pause and you say to yourself, I have no idea what I'm doing. What are they paying me for? You can all come back. I don't know how many of you maybe go through that feeling every day. I go through it very often. But I think the key here is the kind of key thing to talk about is that we're all innately going through that experience every day as humans. We're all innately feeling like we're not good enough, or feeling some level of fear about not just the work we're doing, but just the process of what that looks like, of showing up and of doing the job that either we've employed to do or playing the role that we've been asked to play or that we've wanted to play. And no matter how good an organization you're in or how kind of centered you are, we're all going to come to that place sometime where we experience that kind of fear. For me, many, many years ago, I used to work at a water utility. It's a funny old story, from water utility to kind of like sexy whatever tech startup. But when I was at that water utility, one of the sort of formative things I experienced was I was sat next to the real estate and facilities people. And for those of you that are familiar with water utilities, I think the model's kind of pretty similar all over the Western world. They've often come from government. A lot of them have been privatised. This one particularly had been. But even so, there are people there that have been working there for many, many decades. And the chap that I used to sit next to, Paul, had celebrated his 45th anniversary at the water utility. Not his 35th birthday, his 45th anniversary at the water utility. He'd gotten a job there as a 15-year-old apprentice, and, do the math. So, Paul had been around a long time, and there was a lot of people at that company that had been around similarly. And I remember really vividly one day, this is sort of around the GFC, so it's sort of 2007, 2008. There was a lot of people that in that business, to be a water utility, you have to dig pipes, you have to dig holes, those sorts of things. So there's a lot of people wearing high vis and kind of walking around and in trucks and doing those sorts of things. And so one of those people came in one day off the street, and he had a sort of a craggly beard and kind of a stooped walk, and he kind of wandered up the hall, and he just doesn't look like he fits in corporate Australia or corporate America or wherever you're from. And Paul, who knows everyone because he's been there 45 years, remember, kind of says, "Oh, Frank. Oh, how you doing, Frank? Oh, it's great to see you. What are you doing in here? You're never here." And Frank kind of is, mumbles a little bit. He's like, "Oh, yeah, Paul, just came in, got some things to sort out." And sort of Paul said, "Oh, you're retiring soon, aren't you? You're nearly up. You're nearly due." And sort of Frank sort of says, "Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, that's true, yeah." And then Paul says, "So what can I help you with? What can I do?" And Frank kind of produces his security swipe card. I don't know if you've all got those, but they've got your face on it. When you hit a point where you're in a building, you need to present that, you need to present your security badge. And so Frank says, "Oh, well, it's worn off." And so from the decades, I can only guess that Frank had that thing and was swiping in every day. His face had completely gone. His face was gone off the card. And so Frank said, "Oh, yeah, it's a pretty well-worn one." Sort of bandishes his out to sort of show off his is also worn off. And Frank says, "Yeah, well, the GFC's hit and my savings are all gone, so I've got to work for another 10 years. And so I wanted to get a new security card." And I was sitting there whilst I sort of was watching all that, and I was like, whoa, that's pretty. I don't know if for me it was a fearful thing. That's not to cast any judgment on those people. They are living their lives too, but it's a fear for them. Imagine the fear that Paul feels in that moment, and Frank. And so I think for me, when we're thinking about making this transition to a kind of responsive operating model, we have to think about those things too. They're there, they're present. These things hold us back from doing that. When you think about that, you think, well, okay, we're all human, we're all here, we're all doing this thing. The next thing that it's kind of easy to forget about, and easy to forget as teams are kind of going through dealing with this, is that teams get confused. You've got all of these individuals kind of who are fearful and are kind of walking through their process. When you put them all together into a sort of model where they have to depend upon each other, and we've talked about this theme has come out a lot today, it's very easy for people to get confused very, very quickly. I won't speak too much longer on this one, other to say that you all know this feeling. You've all been in a team where it's just formed together and no one's really sure what they're doing. And actually, Simon, who was on stage earlier from the Pepsi example, kind of said it really aptly. He just said people don't know what they're responsible for, and they don't know what the people around them are responsible for. And it's a really sort of confusing place to put people if you sort of make this transition and say, hey, we're gonna move to this really responsive model, we're gonna do it. And then sort of put them in that team's place and sort of depend upon them to kind of get it all done, we need to understand that people are often really confused when we make that transition. And then the third fear is a different one, slightly altogether. This fear is one that I sort of played around with a little bit, trying to figure out what to call it, but I'd call it alignment anxiety. And so if you kind of consider the nested kind of tree of those things, if you consider individuals who are fearful, if you consider teams that are confused and don't really know what they're doing or what their peers are supposed to be doing, then you kind of get to the next level where in our traditional model, if you imagine an executive or put yourselves in the role, if someone has hired you to come into a business and run it, and really sort of not just run it, but achieve the kind of outcomes and results that you're looking for, your investors or your board or your shareholders, whatever it might be. And in that environment, you have to sort of, one of the levers you get to pull is the ability to kind of forcibly align everybody around that purpose. Like, hey, we're going to go this way. And the whole organization kind of lines up. And I saw a really great example of this. I was previously at Yammer. You might have heard Adam speak earlier today. When we were acquired by Microsoft, one of the most amazing things I experienced was that going through that acquisition, I guess when Microsoft spend a certain amount of money on an acquisition, you eventually land up in, at some point the top brass has to get involved in doing that. And so Steve Ballmer, who this is a photo of, who was previously the CEO of Microsoft before Satya Nadella, basically had a very small list of things every year that he cared about. And that list, I actually can't remember the exact name, so I'll just call it the Ballmer list. But basically, if you're on the Ballmer list, everything, prioritization and resources took care of themselves. It cascaded from the very top all the way through. And I was based out there with another colleague of mine, Gus, who's here today. We were out in the boondocks of Australia. I was in Sydney, Gus was in Melbourne. And we could feel it, we would be out there where, we're miles away from headquarters and out of time zone and everything else. And I'd be sitting in the little kitchenette having a coffee or something, and someone who I didn't know would come up to me and kind of say, "Oh, g'day. Oh, yeah, you're the Yammer guy. Yeah, I've got to talk to you. Yeah, you're on my numbers this year, or you're on my numbers this quarter. We've got to have a conversation and figure it out." And for little old me, that was great. I was Mr. Popular because there's not many things that fall on that list. But it's that kind of fear that I think executives and leaders, and actually any centralized function, has when they come to making a change like this. Marketing or, in some other businesses, finance, operations, anybody that's kind of needs some sort of centralized alignment and function really requires that kind of ability to align the forces and align the troops, so to speak. And so when you take that tool away or that lever away from the leaders that join your organization mid-transition, as we've had leaders join, they go through a process of understanding, well, how do I now make change if I can't pull that lever? How do I get this great, diaspora of people and teams to kind of align around one common mission if I can't just tell them what to do? And so I think these are the three things that we've seen at Culture Amp. I wouldn't say we've necessarily labelled them as such internally. I sort of always want to be really truthful with audiences when we talk about these things. But these are things that I've sort of felt and known, and having served on that exec and leadership team now for a couple of years, there are things that sort of, to me, we can kind of categorise and bucket the different sorts of work that we do into. But the trick about them is that they're not all individual. They are all linked. And so you can't really think about dealing with one in isolation. You have to think about dealing with them all as three things. And so if we're making a transition to a more responsive model, we really have to sort of try to ask the question, well, first of all, coming back to it, why are we going to do that? And then how are we going to be able to cope with doing something poorly for a little longer than we have done in the past? And then finally, how will we know if this is the right decision, and how do we kind of get better and iterate on that as we go? And so these are some things that we did to kind of along that journey. And I actually talk about Team of Teams as a thing we've done here rather than sort of the broad thing that we did, because it is just one investment decision that we've made. It's one piece of armour that we decided to put on our plane as we were sort of flying the ship. We've been trying to be a responsive organisation, I would say, from our very inception. But we've only really come to the Team of Teams model in the last couple of years. And so I sort of want to walk you through some of the concrete investments and the concrete things that we've done on that journey, having seen those fears and conflicts and things come up as we've been gathering our data and listening to our campers, who are what we call our colleagues and people, and then how we've sort of gone about enacting that. So the first one is adopting the team of teams model, and I won't talk too much about this now because we've got Jeff's session tomorrow. I really encourage you to sort of go to it and listen to it. But really, at the core kernel of this, what does this mean? We're all in teams. Is this really a change? And it is actually a pretty big one, and there's kind of two things to keep in mind about this. First and foremost is that teams are cross-functional and multidisciplinary. And so in our world, that means that to visualize this, we've got salespeople in teams with customer-facing people, in teams with product and engineering people, in teams with finance people. And so not all of our teams are shaped that way, but there are teams and collections of people within Culture Amp that do look that way. Our kind of standard customer-facing team has 3 or so salespeople, 3 or so customer success people, and then a sort of collection of one account manager, and then one person or one role that for us is kind of a deep domain expert around insight strategy that sort of has a long and storied background in kind of organizational psychology, which for us in our field is a crucial thing. So to picture what that looks like, you're not in your sales team or your finance team, or whatever it might be. You're in a team where you're all actually mission-driven, which is the second thing. And so as a group, you come together, you work with one of the other teams we've got in that collection called the growth team to really set and understand your mission. And then from there, you go as a team and you go and get your mission done. You achieve your goal. And so for us, we adopted that. Jeff will go into much more detail tomorrow, but this one is a particularly special one because as we did that, things got kind of chaotic out there for a little while, but at some point I realized, oh no, this is the right thing. Chaos is good. We do have now we have 6 or maybe 7 teams now that are customer facing. So to just talk really purposefully about the customer side of the house for a moment. And so those 6 or 7 teams are based in different geos, or they have different missions around a segment or whatever it might be. And so in a normal organization, you really sort of learn one thing at one time. So maybe the sales organization is functionally aligned, and so you learn basically how to run that sales division according to that sales leader's sort of predisposed ideas. In our organization, we learn that serially. So if you imagine, we have 6 different experiments running essentially at any one time, trying to figure out how to do their job and kind of sell Culture Amp and support our customers in being the most successful they can be in different sort of spaces and different markets. And so the way I actually think about this is, back to a former colleague of mine at Adams at Yammer, a guy called Chris Gale, who talked about this idea of low sliders. And sort of, if you imagine this soundboard, you get to see, and everybody gets to see, this is not something that's just the domain of management. You get to see which sliders are up and which sliders are down. And you get to see teams learn things that other teams haven't learnt yet. And then actually the game becomes picking the high slider and saying, oh, they're doing something really good. We should try to push all the other teams, or we should try to just connect all of the other teams better to help them all learn how to go up that chain together. So that's been one really big payoff from the team of teams that we've found. We've learnt a lot of things very quickly. The next investment that we've made is a topical one. Basically, we don't pay, and in the tech sort of world, just to sort of give everyone a quick sense, it's fairly the norm to pay everyone kind of a sales or salaried commission, particularly in the sales realm. And so we chose very deliberately, even 6 years ago, to not do that. So nobody at Culture Amp receives a salaried commission. We're all on base flat wages. And so really, when you think about compensation, it's one of those things that's kind of complicated and simple at the same time. It's simple in the fact that we know from a research perspective, from a statistical point of view, salary doesn't affect engagement. So if you ask people, if we took a poll of you now and said, how much does your salary matter? Almost none of your answer, even if you hated it or you loved it, would affect actually that you were showing up and engaged in the job that you were doing. The difference is, and the complicated bit, is that the way you choose to pay people and spend money and invest in things does have an impact upon your culture. And so it does kind of create these kind of behaviours that you do see prevalent in your organisation as you're working this way. And so we have a saying, do you want to eat what you kill, or do you sort of want to hunt as a pack? And for Culture Amp, we've chosen to hunt as a pack. And so I think it's important to consider this because it helps you address some of those fears that we were talking about just before. And the final thing is community. And we are a community here today, where amongst us, we're in this room. We're all here because we've chosen to be. We are a great example of sort of what I'm talking about here. But these things don't happen by chance. Robin, it's not just true that we've all rocked up here and Robin's kind of opened the doors and said, oh my goodness, there's an audience. This is great. And oh, there's some speakers and there's some AV stuff. And oh, it's wonderful, Community takes real investment and it takes real work and effort to getting that done. If any of you are lucky enough to have stopped by our booth out there today, you would have seen our collection of campers, but also Nina, whose whole job is this. I mean, this is Nina's we have now a team dedicated at Culture Amp to doing nothing but showing up at these kind of events, creating our own events and connecting and building a community of people that are trying to learn how to do what we're trying to do. And that's no small feat. It's really easy to sit in a meeting or an executive meeting or a leadership meeting and say, yeah, community, we should do that. It's a very different thing to funnel investments and dollars and hire people and kind of set them out into the world to go and make the connections that are possible to do that. I mean, even just today, we've got other campers from our teams that are customer facing here that have taken 2 days out of their work, and they've all chosen to be here because of that, So investing in community is the third kind of plank of things that we did. And so when we come back and we think about this, we're making this transition to being a responsive organisation. We know it's hard, but we're measuring, we're taking pulse checks along the way. And then we realise we've made these investments now. And so in some ways, just like the planes that Abraham Wald was studying, we've kind of begun to choose our bets. We've kind of begun to start saying, yeah, we're going to put some armour there, and we're going to put some armour there, and we're going to put some armour here. And actually, holy goodness, we're kind of flying okay. We might make it back. We might make it out alive. But the thing about these things is that they are also all interlinked. And so if you do one of these things well, if you just don't pay commission, that's kind of cool, and maybe you get a really great sales culture, but you don't necessarily guarantee that your product and engineering organisation gets the benefits of that. And then likewise, if you invest in community, maybe that's great for your product and engineering group, but sales and customer hate you because you're always talking to my customers, they're coming to these events, I never get an invite, what's up, And so we've done I want to sort of walk you through 3 examples of how these things are interlinked and how they've played out for us. And so I'll sort of walk you through them now. This is Jo, who's in our Melbourne office. One of sort of the examples, or one of the things that we've done is we launched a second product not that long ago, maybe about 15 months ago. Well, actually, I take that back. We didn't launch it 15 months ago. We started work on it 15 months ago. So 15 months ago, Didier, our CEO, and Rod, our VP of product, came together not because they were necessarily in the roles they were in, but just because they had the context to say, yeah, we're missing a trick here. We've seen the data. Our customers are using our platform in a certain way, and they're hacking it to try to develop an individual 360 type tool. We can do better than that. We can provide them with a better thing. So they got together, they started it, but then they pulled together a team very quickly that built a sort of MVP or a very basic version of that product in only 6 weeks. So we went from having nothing, having no second product, to having, with just some customers that were kind of hacking it together and kind of doing it, to having a product that we didn't dream of having 6 weeks later, kind of ready at least to begin going out to customers and showing. And we did that, we sort of got that out there, and that's not actually that much of an unfamiliar story. Some of you might be thinking, yeah, you got some engineers, you put them in a room, you let them alone, they build something, great, we've heard that before. I think the thing that is more interesting is that we then went from having that product go to 0% of our customer base to 15% of our customer base in the next 6 months. And that transition's much harder to make. And the way that we did that, the way we were able to learn to do that, was that team was a team of teams team. We had community investments going on, and we didn't have any commission kind of in place. So right away, this team went and grabbed a salesperson from the Melbourne office and said, hey, can you come and join us? We want you to get on some calls. And that person, because they weren't constrained by a sales model or a sales commission kind of scary thing, was like, yeah, great, I'd love to do that. We've got a new product, awesome. I'll come over here, I'll get on some calls. How can I talk to customers? So we jumped on calls, we started selling it. And then it just turns out that, we've got some events coming up next week. Oh, that's great. Where are the events? Everywhere in the world? We're doing 80 events all around the world this year? My goodness. Well, let's start talking about it. And so right away, we're able to move from having no product at all to having one in the hands of our early customers, to having it in the hands of our teams that could go out there, and we're already beating the drum about these things. And we could show up in those sorts of places. And so long story short, we are now sort of at slightly more than 15% of the customer base 15 months later that have adopted that product. But now we're sort of at that point and sort of true kimono moment, we've now got to figure out, okay, Now how do we get the alignment to get all of our customers kind of wanting to use that and sort of seeing the value and the benefit of that product? But to go on the journey we have done so far has been a really interesting thing. The second example is actually the team that is based here in New York. I kind of wanted to share a bit of a local example. In every organization you hear about like great ways to start teams and great ways to found offices and great ways to do all these things. This team had none of that. This team was started in the sort of classic kind of model. We had one person that was hired very early on that was actually up in Boston. She moved down. We hired a second person right away, and they sort of just cobbled together, and then very quickly the team began to grow, really before we knew what we were doing. Not the people here, before just broadly the organisation knew what we were doing. And suddenly we had a business out here. We had a really large business of thriving customers. And I think the reason I sort of talk about this is not because of anything else other than this team has been autonomous and has been kind of independent from the get-go. They have had to be, because they're over the other side of the world from our headquarters. And so they've had to be autonomous. They've had to sort of take all of those things, those investments that we've just talked about, and they've had to figure them all out on their own. And it's no surprise, actually, that this team is also our highest revenue generator around the world. So think about that for a moment. The team that was furthest away from headquarters, that had the least amount of kind of overlap with time zones and meetings and those sorts of things, is the one that's generating the most revenue all around the world. And this is them. There's nobody else behind the stage. There's nobody else kind of waiting in the wings. This team has sort of brought in more than $3 million in the last couple of years. Real cash and real sort of things. And so they're not quite the numbers that Simon was able to kind of talk about when he was up here. $30 billion budget lines are hard to come by. But I think it's a really proud thing. And the final example, I really didn't want to put this in because we were trying to do this whole mafia thing and like, oh, aren't we cool? This is actually more what we're more closer to our sort of selves. But basically, the other big problem that we solved on the journey, sort of putting these investments together, is that we're a SaaS business like many other sort of tech companies that have started up in that field. And one of the things you notice when you do that is you have to go and, one of the core promises of SaaS is you have to renew your customers. You have to go back and actually get them to sign up again. And we're lucky. Our customers love us and we love our customers. But that can be a tough conversation to navigate. And sort of going right back to kind of individual fear mode, none of the people here in this photo had actually really negotiated the contract, including myself, in sort of all honesty, before we'd sort of all come together. And so this isn't a team. This is, to be really clear, each of these members were in different teams out there trying to figure out this problem on their own. But this is a great example of that slider analogy. Sly, who's up the back left there, was really one of the first ones to sort of nut out a particular type of approach that actually saw us get really great results. Josh, who's kind of hiding under the lampshade, was one of the next people that took that work and kind of found out a way to kind of automate it. And Giuliano, who's kind of laughing and pointing here, was sort of one of the ones that sort of took that and now has taken that approach to our sort of SMB market. And so it's kind of easy to sort of talk about, these are easy things, or we just go hire people, and there's some element of truth to that. We would all be humbly telling you that, there's about 1 million people in the world that would be more qualified to do that job than what we were all doing. And I think the important thing is none of us are on commission, so we all just dug in and did this because it was a task that needed to be done. We're in teams, so we could learn about that cross-functionally and kind of iterate in a serial sense as we were going. And our community really helped us. We were able to plug into our internal community and learn those lessons from each other, as well as talk to customers at events. Every event I go to, there is some customer that we need to renew that happens to show up, and I'm like, oh, it's not planned. It's like, oh, that's a really amazing thing. I'll go and talk to that person now, and we can sort of get into that. So I think in the last year, we've renewed again more than $10 million in ARR. And so really there's only one person missing out of this photo, a chap by the name of Will, who sort of played a lot into that role. But everybody kind of figured that out together. It's not like this was anybody's job or anybody's role. And now we've kind of separated that out and we've kind of built a new kind of practice around that. But at the time, you don't know what lessons you have to learn as you're going through it. And so the sort of investments that we made helped us do that. So where are we at? We're back to the start. I'm also over time, and I realise I'm the last thing between us and a drink. So I'm wrapping up right now. But where does that leave us? We're here, and we're all here. We're bought into trying to make this kind of transition and make this change. But oftentimes we're not seeing the sort of the whole light, if you like. Well, we're not seeing the planes coming back from the fights that they're in and the dog fights that they're a part of. We send our people out on these missions. We say, go and change, go and be different, go and work different, go and do different. And then they come back and they've got bullet holes all over them. And they're saying, look, I got shot. Oh man, it really hurt. That person really annoyed me, or that didn't work, or this didn't work. But we don't really have a great way yet to capture all of that sort of information so that we can make better investments to armour them better for when they next go out and when they next try to make that change. And so, I think really if I sort of leave you with anything else, or if I leave you with anything from today, it's that these, I'm going to jump back a little bit, these fears, I don't pretend for a moment that they're the same fears that you would find. They might be, but I don't pretend that they're the same. They were the ones that I think we've found and I think I've seen. But the real trick here, the one thing I want to leave you with, or the one thing I'd love for you to take away from this session today, is that making this kind of change is really hard. I think it remains really hard. I think we keep talking we're used to things scaling and growing out of us. I don't think this is a thing that scales away. I think this remains really hard. And I think when you really start thinking about that and start thinking, yeah, this isn't going away, it's going to be painful the whole time, you really come home to sort of understand and ask yourself the question, well, okay, if it is going to be hard, then how am I going to stay sane in that journey? How am I going to fly my plane such that I'm going to keep bringing that thing home and not get shot down? And so that's sort of the only real thing I'd like to leave you with, is to sort of remember the story of Abraham Wald, and just remember that this is hard and we can make the transition, but we've got to kind of keep thinking about it and keep learning and keep listening to the signals as we do it. So thank you very much for your extended time. I'll see you all for a drink.